went to the San Francisco stop of Jordan B. Peterson's tour for Beyond Order, 12 More Rules for Life, and I have some thoughts. This video made possible thanks to the continuing support of viewers, patrons, and PayPal pals like you. Thanks! Hi, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, hello! Let me quickly lay out some personal information bits so you don't feel surprised by the, let's call it, tone of the video. I am a cognitive psychologist and am doing YouTube because life can be funny sometimes. I've been analyzing and critiquing Peterson's books since 2019, and the length of this process is partially a product of going through and digging through his sources when they're given, as well as working through the arguments and their implications, and things aren't always hunky-dory. The most memorable example for me was in 12 Rules for Life, with the claim that a defeated lobster's brain will, quote, basically dissolve and grow a new one. But the reference here says nothing about melting lobster brains, not a peep. I'm not even sure where Peterson was getting his idea from. It certainly wasn't this paper. And this sort of thing happens consistently throughout 12 Rules. Misrepresenting or misinterpreting empirical work, like with reference 165 found in Rule 11, the kids skateboard one. He says safety features will be defeated by people in an attempt to maintain some optimal level of danger to develop their skills. The actual gist from that reference is that vehicular safety features don't always result in the sort of safety gains predicted. It posits that people have some level of risk they're comfortable with, so if driving is perceived to be safer, they may drive a bit riskier. Like, better brakes means you can brake harder later than if you had worse brakes. So sure, this almost sort of supports his claim that people have an optimal danger point, but does absolutely nothing for the why, and I'd say that that is the more important thing to back up here. And then there's the times when he makes strong claims with no empirical support, like when he basically talked about epigenetics in Rule 8, tell the truth or at least don't lie. Especially when his claims go well beyond what the science indicates. Or there's the instances of bumping up against cognitive processes or constructs and building his own just-so story for its purpose or how it works. Or telling people they don't really know or understand themselves. But we're going to stop the list here, because if we went into the shame, weird assumptions, and general what the fuckery, we'd be here all day. The case has been argued in my comments section that these books aren't academic works, and as such, I am holding him to too high of a standard. My response to that is, as long as his branding and authority are relying on his clinical psychology PhD, and he's making claims that he says are empirically true, he better be able to back up those claims. Last thing. Initially, I wasn't planning on doing the dual setup thing, but I think it'll help with the flow of things, so this is for my thoughts and responses to what Peterson's saying, and this is for what Peterson said during the talk. Alright, enough preamble. Let's get to the meat of this video. Thankfully, Peterson wasn't in his angry form that night, but a friendly, affable, chatty version. There was also a high-pitched frequency thing happening up in the balcony, and somebody in the audience was like, hey, there's a problem, and he handled it well. Made sure that the audience was comfortable, so absolutely props where they're due. Also, it's incredibly minor, but I want to point out the bisexual lighting they used. I know it's sort of a joke in this space, but for Lobster Daddy himself to use it, mwah. Overall, I'm not sure how much new information or insights I walked away from this with. I think it's running into the same complaints that I am having with Beyond Order. It's the same arguments and the same names that we've seen over and over again, just in a different order or context. So if the fan reviews are anything to go by, it seems like the night I went to may have been one of the optimal versions for me to go to, at least with regard to this. One review said he talked about a couple points for the Rule de Nuit and then answered some questions. Like, just a rule, pulled out a couple pieces he wanted to talk about that night, and that's it. Just the same information you got in the book, only in person. And maybe for fans, that's enough. For musical performances, there is some value in going and seeing whatever musical artist live instead of just listening to their stuff again at home. And if the Lobsters felt that they got their money's worth out of this, cool. But I was hoping for something more, especially with the shift in format they did that night. I saw him in San Francisco on 420. Going into it, I wasn't sure what he was going to talk about. On his Parler, he would sometimes post what the rule going to be talked about that night was. No such post was made for San Fran. And why he posts some more basic, boring stuff on Parler and his hot takes on Twitter is something I'll probably never understand. Parlay, I don't know. Earlier in the tour, I think Peterson would be joined by his daughter Michaela, but at least in San Francisco, it was his wife Tammy on the stage with him. She let us know that they would be trying something new that night. Instead of Peterson talking about one of the rules at length and then having Q&A at the end, they were going to do the entire thing as one big long Q&A session. And she said that they always had more questions than they could possibly answer, and so maybe this way they'd be able to get to more of the questions and have more of sort of an interactive experience. I'll mention this here because I have been asked a couple times. You don't get to physically ask your questions. There's flyers everywhere that has a little code that you put in at the website and then you ask your question that way. And it seems like that is using the airport code of the city, but I could be wrong. This online format is probably the most efficient way to get through questions, as you're not having to hand a microphone to people and hope that they can ask a question quickly. It also means that the production, meaning Peterson probably, can curate the questions asked. I didn't realize this until I got home, but there's also a thumbs up system with this, and it looks like the questions picked tended to be the more liked. Before bringing Peterson out, she plugged their son's app called Essay, which was co-developed with Peterson, and it'll be launching probably this week. Interesting his son's being folded into this project. My understanding is that his background's in music, but maybe he'll be the frictionless disruptor the essay writing industry needs. In other family news, Michaela is excited about the Peterson Academy, which was described as her bringing in professors, recording them lecture about something, and posting that online. The online footprint for this academy is pretty small right now. There's a 2018 piece from Mike, which is a thing that's part of the same parent company as Gawker and Elite Daily, about this proposed online academy that seems to have had higher goals than just a collection of videos. There's also the YouTube channel, Jordan Peterson Academy, that currently has 7,000 subscribers, a collection of Peterson videos last updated a year ago, and puts its location as Australia. Whatever it actually is, Tammy said it'll launch in the fall. Peterson time. His first words to the crowd were, quote, "I'm surprised it's legal for you people to be here." If you aren't aware, Peterson has turned into quite the ardent anti-mask, anti-vax person, and it sort of fits his brand of being against compelled actions by the government, as well as the thought that this is authoritarian overreach. The first question asked, if you were elected to be in charge of the world, what problems would you initially focus on? The closest thing we got to a direct answer to this question is he'd, quote, "fix the system that elected me so that never happens again, because that seems like a really bad idea." His explanation touched on his time with the Canadian NDP as a youth, the Conservative Party of Canada collapsing because of the Freedom Trucker rally thing, and people telling him that he should throw his hat in the ring for the Prime Minister job of Canada. He says this isn't really an option for him because he doesn't have the right temperament for it. Other IDW members, like Douglas Murray, enjoy conflict, and he doesn't unless he feels like it's preventing something worse. This came as news to me. He can be pretty confrontational on Twitter, so how much worse does he think he's fighting off on a daily basis? He also said the problems he wants to solve can't be solved politically. This was explained by way of Solzhenitsyn and the Gulag prison guards, and the way to solve these sorts of problems is to get people to, quote, reacquaint themselves with the appropriate ethical pathway. He doesn't say what this pathway actually is, just that it needs to be developed psychologically or spiritually on an individual level. I think I have a pretty good handle on things Peterson has said in the books, and I don't really have a clear idea of what this appropriate ethical pathway is, either from the books or from the talk that night. If I had to guess, I would say it's probably along the lines of his whole creative conservative thing for how to live your life. But even that is kind of nebulous beyond do what's always been done, except for when it becomes tyrannical. An interesting wrinkle is the added caveat that Peterson thinks it's a, quote, mistake for him to speak politically, end quote, and that he doesn't really have anything more interesting to say than someone random on the street. So his whole thing about the Canadian Bill C-16 was what, then? preventing something worse, or a mistake. His continued doom-warning about the legal ramifications of that bill would suggest he believes the former, despite it not having the actual consequences he foresaw. Speaking of, the Deem of the Hey It's variety should have a video coming out on Peterson's misunderstanding of a lot of things, including C16, with some very cool new insights. Like, I don't want to spoil it, but I'm very excited, and it should be coming out soon, so check it out when it does. It can feel like he doesn't understand the consequences of the social media platform he has at this point. If he thinks it's a mistake for him to talk politically, he really needs to stop popping off about things like climate change, trans athletes, or vaccine mandates. Question 2. Have you considered the problem of suffering? If so, what are your thoughts on it? At this point, I was wondering how familiar some people in the audience were with Peterson's work. Has he considered the problem of suffering? It's like asking a cat if it's considered gravity. Suffice it to say, there wasn't much in this answer that wasn't in 12 Rules. My notebook for the evening that I was furiously scribbling in the entire time in case my audio failed. So, the answer. Suffering is inevitable. You have to figure out what sustains you, which demonstrates what's valuable. Western culture says you can't go wrong with truth, beauty, and love. You have an ethical obligation to, quote, move forward in faith and truth and in the spirit of love, end quote, in spite of suffering, because if you don't, your suffering will increase and you'll make others suffer too. Faust and Mephistopheles, Dostoevsky, and the atheist argument leads to dark places, and the antidote to suffering is courageous faith. So that answer, but for 12 minutes. Next question. How do you draw the line between settling with a partner because nobody's perfect versus finding someone that offers much more than a lack of major disagreements? This was the question that had the most new content for me and some alright advice. You made an interesting observation here. The way these questions are asked is sort of indicative or telling of something that the person who's asking it should work on. Said another way, the way it's phrased now, the emphasis is on what other people need to be instead of how the person themselves can be a better partner. I can see and even agree with that. If somebody is struggling to find a partner when they want one, it may be time to take a step back and have a long, hard look at themselves. Like, are they throwing something off that is just sending people running away, or what's going on there? But I would have liked to have seen some more nuance here. There needs to be a balance between growing and working on being a better partner, but also respecting your boundaries. Not emphasizing this balance between the two could potentially set somebody up to be taken advantage of. Question 4. Are all rules worth following, or are some worth breaking? The one rule he said to never break was to tell the truth, or at least don't lie. Never, ever break that one. I'm honestly a bit sad that he didn't also say the original's Rule 12. Pet a cat when you see one on the street. And yeah, you don't want to pet every cat on the street if it's like rabid or something, but stopping to appreciate your life, the good things in your life, the good people, the good pets, the good stuff is important. He noted that people commonly get hung up on this one because of white lies, and his explanation for why white lies even weren't okay is by way of example that, let's say your partner, be realistic who we're talking about here, your wife is asking how she looks. He made a distinction here that I do think is useful. Asking this sort of question because you're looking for some sort of approval or affection versus asking because you legitimately want to know if you look okay. I absolutely agree that when possible, be direct. But I also know what it's like to really be wanting to hear something from your partner, sending them a softball question in the hopes of getting that itch scratched, and all of it just going catastrophically up in flames. We have his permission to deviate from the other rules. Sort of. Quote, the rules are useful in that they're good general guidelines and that you deviate from them at your peril. Right. This then turned into the whole conservatives as the holders of the best way of doing things except for exceptional circumstances, and the odds are that you aren't exceptional, so... And then he talked about the same apocryphal story that we saw in Rule 1 of Jesus talking to somebody who was working on the Sabbath day, and if you know what you're doing, you're cool, but if you don't know what you're doing, cursed ye be. Then he dropped what I think is something I hadn't seen or heard from him before. Basically, we fucked ourselves by wanting the convenience of having things open on Sunday. That was supposed to be a day of rest, but we couldn't just leave things be. No, we want to have the convenience of stuff being open, and so because we violated the sanctity of that day, that's why we have the 24/7 work culture that we have now. I didn't say it was a good idea. How can non-believers exist alongside an omniscient being who longs for them to know him? Wouldn't God know exactly what would convince them? Side note before continuing. One of the fan reviewers I found said that he enjoys Peterson's life advice stuff, but that he isn't so keen on the philosophical tangents. And I kind of wonder how common that sentiment is amongst the lobsters, and what their experience of reading the books is like, because those tangents can be a lot for me. Novel thought thread that will bite him in the ass later this video. He laid out the core of his response at the top of this answer. Quote, "Fealty given by demand is worthless." This is because what you would want is ethical faith, which is apparently along the lines of the courageous faith he talked about in an earlier answer, where you're able to keep going in the face of suffering and temptation. If God compelled people to believe, it wouldn't be ethical faith. And further explanation of this came by way of saying that if you beat your kids to do good, they're doing good, but it's inferior to them just doing good on their own. I probably don't need to remind you, dear viewer, of his parenting advice and how it included judiciously hitting your kids. So, I feel like there's a little bit of a logical bump here. The evidence that God hasn't compelled us to believe is that there are non-believers. But there's still the threat of punishment in play under most Christian doctrines. It's just more of the when your father gets home variety. If you don't accept Jesus Christ as your personal Lord and Savior, you will be punished for eternity. How is that not belief compulsion? Bumping up against a good point again, Peterson said that healthy relationships require voluntary participation. Good points. We'd like to see it. Except for that pesky little detail that voluntary participation can be withdrawn. And Peterson doesn't really allow for that. In 12 Rules, he compared the people in a marriage to, quote, "two cats in a barrel, bound by the oath that lasts in theory until one or both of you die." This is a metaphor he reuses in Beyond Orders Rule 10. Plan and work diligently to maintain the romance in your relationship. You cats in a barrel, you. Voluntary participation in a relationship requires the ability to not participate. If you're shackled to the other person, it's not voluntary. Pearson wrapped up this answer by saying that compelled good isn't actually good. Question 6. Are you familiar with the problem of instruction? How is God not responsible for instructing humanity better? Seems Peterson was keen on talking religion that night, but with the added context that came up at some point during this talk that his next book is going to be called We Who Wrestle with God, these sorts of thoughts are probably more at the forefront these days. Anyways, place your bets. Which 2 recurring stories are going to be used here? We've got God on the table, and humanity failing in some capacity. That narrows it down a bit, but I suspect that one of the 2 is going to be harder to guess. And I think that's enough stalling for thinking time. First up is Milton and Paradise Lost. Peterson said that Milton set out to, quote, "justify the ways of God to man." That's certainly one way to describe what is basically biblical fanfic. Quote, "God gave you what you need, you failed to use it," end quote. Basically, it's not God's fault that we fail or we suck. We were given free will, and we're just not using it right. To be fair, he did point out how convenient that explanation is for God. Along similar lines of thought, he asked, quote, "Have you been given everything you need to stand?" End quote. How much of your suffering is due to an inadequacy in the structure of reality, and how much of your suffering is your fault? Oh, you know where this is going. Getting some real set your house in perfect order before you criticize the world energy up in here. Or, perhaps more relevant for this tour, do not carelessly denigrate social institutions or creative achievement. Potato, potato. As I've said before on this channel when we've run into this topic, it's good to take ownership for things that you are responsible for your life situation, for suffering, for whatever. Own your part. But that doesn't mean that there aren't also possibly systemic or structural factors fucking with your life, or that all of these things can't possibly interact because they can. And all of that is completely just leaving out the factor of luck, because luck can really help or it can really hurt. So it probably isn't surprising what story's coming next. The second story is Cain and Abel and sacrifice and all of that ground that he just loves retreading. New idea. He views the culture war as a manifestation of the eternal war between Cain and Abel set against a background of chaos and order. He got a lot of applause for that one. Then it's time to talk sacrifice for a while, and once was good for me, thanks. And hey, if your job isn't feeling like a sacrifice, it's not work, it's play. And that's a bad thing? So in his framework, productive work requires sacrifice. But imagine how much happier, or at least content, everybody would be if we enjoyed our jobs, or at least didn't hate them, if people weren't compelled to sacrifice in order to take care of themselves and their loved ones. He's not done with this question yet. Further talking about the Cain and Abel story, he said that Cain didn't give God his best, and that is why his sacrifice was rejected. Before we even get started, it's a story. A biblical story, yes, but a story. All the King James Version says here is Abel kept sheep, Cain was a tiller of the ground. And when it was time to make their offerings, Cain gave the fruit of the ground, Abel a sheep. And God was apparently on a proto-lion diet because he was not about the veggie option. And then was like, nah, brah, it's not my preference. It's why your thing sucks. It's because your offering sucks. I don't see anything in Exodus to support Peterson's claim that Cain's offering was lower quality than Abel's. Just, it wasn't what God apparently wanted, and I'm not even sure God told them, like, oh, yeah, meat or nothing. I see some talk about later New Testament retcons emphasizing the difference in quality between sacrifices, or that flat out a plant product will never match a meat product. But that sort of makes it worse, doesn't it? If that's the case, Cain was set up to fail. Just like if God was vegetarian or vegan, Abel would have failed, just because they didn't know his sacrificial dietary preference going in. But enough of this rant. The next talking point wasn't a story, but it was about the Columbine shooters and how they ruminated in their resentment and let sin in to have its way with them. Mercifully, this was dropped quickly to go back to Cain and ask the question, quote, "Are you making use of everything you've been given?" Furthermore, the misery existing in the world is a consequence of us not doing the best we can with what we have available. A mediocre sacrifice, if you will. Going back to the original's Rule 6 somewhat, set your house in perfect order before you criticize the world, you are in no position to judge unless you have given everything you have towards fixing a problem. There is so much to unpack here. Peterson doesn't seem to acknowledge the possibility that people who are working to change the social institutions may have already tried giving it their all and not gotten a good outcome. Their suffering isn't because they just haven't tried hard enough. It's because the system is doing its damnedest to keep them suffering. Prior to opening up who could get married, gay or lesbian couples would sometimes have to have one person adopt the other person just to have access to the same bureaucratic shortcuts, like tax breaks or hospital visitation rights. I and my family members have never been harassed by police. It's part of my white privilege. A person who commits the crime just of driving while black may suffer for it, and it isn't clear in Peterson's framework how they could have tried harder. Not drive at all? Not exist at all? Leaving that thought where it is to reiterate my advice here. Sometimes suffering you're going through isn't your fault. Sometimes it is, and it's good to know when it is, but it isn't always your fault. And it's important to be able to recognize how much control you have over the situation you're in. There may be workarounds to the parts you don't have control over, or possibly change has to come at the global level and requires group action. Just don't let Peterson lead you to believe that you have to completely exhaust yourself trying to fix your suffering. That isn't healthy. Closing out this answer, Peterson says to sacrifice yourself to God, or whatever the highest good may be. But questioning what is the highest good demolishes good. Gotta get those postmodern potshots in where you can. I've been holding off on just dropping the audio in I have of this, but this part was a little bit funny to me. Some schadenfreude, if you will. Up to this point, the audience had been pretty good on the rhythm between Peterson talking and when was good to clap, and then this happened.
And so, I mean, it is a terrible burden, for people to bear, to say, well, we have to contend with the catastrophe of our self-conscious mortality by striving diligently up the hill with the cross on our back. But, hey, what's the alternative? The alternative is something like hell.
Oh, that was awkward, like at a cellular level awkward. Just Peterson sitting there waiting for applause that didn't happen until he started talking again. Next question. If you have to choose one rule from both the books and put it on a billboard across San Francisco, which one would it be and why? His pick, without much thought, was abandon ideology. The crowd really liked that one. We'll get to this when we get to that rule, but it seems like there's a bit of a set problem here, at least to me, in that abandoning ideology seems like an ideology itself. The way Peterson tries to get out of that problem in the book and tried to get out of it in this talk is to pull a Peterson. I had to go back and check the audio to make sure I wasn't missing any steps in my notes because it's that Peterson-y. He's been playing around with this rule in the tour shows as he's trying to work out an idea for we who wrestle with God. He found out that's what Israel means when working on his Genesis series. His Maps of Meaning students, and no, I didn't leave out a step there, he just directly pivots, asked him how he knows the meta-ethic he developed isn't just another ideology. Distinguishing ideologies from religions, theories, or philosophies is hard. How do you distinguish valid from invalid theories? That question is itself a variation of what is truth? All of these are hard questions, so, quote, what can be valuably turned to as a source of wisdom that is an alternative to ideology? And there are many words about how you shouldn't interchange ideologies willy-nilly, then values existing in a hierarchical structure, because of course. Without a unifying agreement about what's most important, conflict is inevitable. And there were many, many more words, including that he met with some Stanford business professors about their pending work on de-woking the university to get to his idea from Beyond Order's first rule. The best game player is the one who wins at the metagame. And when I say a lot of words, I'm talking about on the order of 15 minutes to get through all of that. Then he interestingly ranked reciprocity as being more important in social interactions than dominance. Judeo-Christian tradition holds that Christ's answer when asked what the most important commandment was that he ducked the question entirely and said to just love everyone, man. And then we finally get to his distinction between ideologies and not ideologies. Truth. Ethical facts. Yup. The difference between the things Peterson wants you to abandon and the meta-ethic that he wants you to adopt is that his meta-ethic is true. I mean, we know he doesn't think trans and or non-binary people are actually trans and or non-binary, but are instead misguided. We also know he doesn't consider self-defined atheists to actually be atheists, or, as we'll see later in Beyond Order, that people can have fulfilling lives without popping out some offspring. It's like he can't see that these things aren't universal truths. They may be true for him, but he needs to stop shoving his ideology down everyone's non-voluntary throats. He defined power as the willingness to compel, and then did this pitch-shifted, bobble-headed retort of, oh, that sounds like patriarchy, when bringing it into the marriage context. Quote, in its entirety, if you're consistently doing nothing but exploiting your wife, of course, by dominating her with compulsion, you're going to have one bloody, miserable marriage, because you're contending with someone, unless your wife is beat 95% to death, she's going to take it out on you in some pretty profound ways. Don't get me wrong, I am 100% team don't beat your partner, but I would hope the reasons for not doing that would be more than just preventing them from making your life miserable in exchange. Then there was some discussion on psychopaths and narcissists, with him saying that people in these groups, when they succeed, it's only because they're faking competence. They're not actually competent, they're just good at looking like they are. He claimed that the proportion of the population that is psychopathic is kept low in a manner similar to that as keeping the predator population smaller than the prey species. And also that if there ends up being too many psychopaths running around, then the non-psychopaths get wise to them and get the numbers back down somehow. Right, yeah. The prey species go big game hunting as soon as the predator species become too numerous. Not that the prey species sort of end up starving some of the predator species when there's not enough prey species to eat, and that there's nice little curves of population dynamics going on where usually too many predator species means that there were a lot of prey species in previous years, and that these things just kind of come in waves. The closing thought for this answer is that all interactions, be it interpersonal to intergovernmental, need to be done on a foundation of radical reciprocity. The penultimate question, which is surely going to be a profound one, right? Where do you get your suits? Yup. Monkey's paw on me, I guess, for once commenting that nobody asks him about his sartorial choices. He went through his fit, but I think the inclusion of this question was to hit a talking point he emphasized earlier in the tour. He took pleasure that his action of taking the extra steps to look as nice as he could on these tours, leading to these young men showing up in their first three-piece suit and dressing like an adult. No joke. I was a little worried about being able to actually find the place because I was dropped off a couple of blocks away until I looked up and saw three youngish guys looking uncomfortable in their suits, holding beyond order-shaped books, and I knew I just had to follow them. Speaking of discomfort, the people around me seemed to shift uncomfortably in their seats a bit at his talk of dressing like an adult, just hoodies and jeans in my near vicinity. Meanwhile, I'm sitting there in this hoodie and athleisure pants like, fuck you, man, and the shoes you walked in on that cost more than my first two cars combined. Literally this hoodie. I figured rocking the citation needed hoodie might have ended poorly, either from somebody seeing it and thinking, she too is anti-vax. I will now talk right in her face about all the anti-vax, anti-mask business, or soliciting unwanted engagement and questions when I just really want to be an observant fly on the wall. So I rushed out a test print of this, and it's a good thing I did because this logo did not print well at all. It's in the wrong place. Whatever. Will be fixed and will be up soonish. You want to dress all nice and fancy? Cool. Have at. But don't be a judgy lobster about it. Also, it feels a bit gauche to talk about how expensive everything you're wearing is when you're in a city sprawl that is really fucking going through income inequality and a housing crisis. Last question. I just got out of a codependent relationship and I love her still. I don't feel whole enough to get back with her. Practical ways to become independent alone? A fair number of questions seem to share some sort of this sentiment. He gave a sort of clinical psychologist answer as he would to a client. The first thing this person needs to do is figure out what independence means to them. Second is to figure out how to make these components of independence as definitions, and then those as things that they can do. If these aren't things the person feels that they can do, lower their aim until they're at tasks the person can accomplish. Then build up those smaller steps into bigger and bigger ones, and eventually they'll be independent. Yeah, that's an answer to the literal question that was asked, but I feel like it's missing a more important issue for this person. Yeah, they probably need to work on their ability to be independent, but they also need to work on being able to feel okay with themselves or whole in themselves. The exact nature of this relationship isn't specified, but just with what's there, oof. I feel like doing the sorts of things Pearson suggested, like mirroring the actions of someone they consider to be independent, aren't going to address the deeper emotional problem, and that could set them up for more negative relationships in the future. How is that not part of Peterson's answer for this? I feel like that sort of thing would be bog standard for a clinical psychologist, especially if somebody drops the word codependent in there. Granted, the full answer of how to get somebody to grow out of being codependent is not as neat and tidy as boosting their feelings of independence. What a disappointment to end the night on. But I was relatively alone in that sentiment, and Peterson got a standing ovation from his adoring crowd. and I'm pretty sure that the music that played as he left the stage was the Pink Floyd cover that he worked on. This was my first live Peterson event, and frankly, I'm a bit underwhelmed. The fans in the audience seem to enjoy it, so arguably this is a matter of taste. I was very disappointed in the lack of chaos. For a tour that's supposed to be centered on a book that is advising us on how to move beyond order, we were still very much in Order City for most of the answers. To try and rectify that balance just a smidge, I'm going to rate the show 2 squirrels in the forest out of 10 chaos dragons. Until next time, bye!